All right, here we are in the second portion of the mental disorders topic, and so we're going to talk about universal syndromes here. But be careful when I say universal syndromes because they are going to have quite different cultural manifestations of the same fundamental disorders. So when we talk about culture bound versus universal syndromes, um, you find that even if they're universal, there will be a lot of their variation in prevalence and presentation and types and subtypes and symptomology and in explanations about and implications of. So there's going to be, even though it was universal, there's just many, many, many ways that they vary. So the most prevalent mental disorder in the world is depression. You find quite a large variation in depression, reports of depression. And so you find in some cultures they have almost zero reported depression. But of course, when it comes to any mental disorders, much of the diagnostics is about self-reporting. So just because people might not report a mental disorder does not mean it's not happening. It means that maybe their culture discourages the reporting of depression. Okay? So the symptoms of depression um, can really fall into these four different domains. The affective or the feelings things, right? The feelings of sadness and worthlessness. A cognitive, that is, I'm a worthless and nothing I can do will make the world any better. Can be behavioral in terms of tiredness, anhedonia, loss of pleasure, all kinds of these appetite changes, etc. But it can, oh, physiological appetite changes and a disruption of all kinds of different changes. So four different domains. And so what you find is that people that do in fact exhibit depression in different cultures will show different patterns of symptomology. And in fact, the one of the ways to break it down is to say that the symptoms of depression can be considered to be either physiological or psychological. And so clearly physiological symptoms are like the loss of appetite and sleep disorders. And the psychological components of depression is clearly going to be more things like mood or guilt or something of this nature, helplessness, worthlessness. And so because of this, you find that Chinese patients, generally speaking, are not diagnosed with depression because they fail to meet the DSM standards by which depression is defined. And DSM defines depression and says, patient will exhibit five or more of these symptoms for 6 months or more, and one of these symptoms must be, all right? It's this kind of a diagnosing system. And the Chinese patients tend not to report the psychological symptoms, but tend to report the physiological symptoms. So a new disorder has been created, but it didn't stick in the DSM, but it was created neurasthenia, and it was essentially a diagnosis of depression for people that are not reporting the psychological symptoms of depression, but are rather reporting the physiological symptoms of depression. Okay, so 87% would be having could be diagnosed as depressed, but only 9% reported the depressed mood. Okay, so they just manifest it differently. Another universal disorder is social anxiety, just a version of anxiety, that whole you got to do an oral presentation in front of the class. You're like, oh shit, oh shit, oh shit. Okay. So, social anxiety, a marked fear of social situations. Um, uh, you realize it's excessive, but you're afraid and you get anxious and you get sick and everything else. Well, you find that social anxiety disorder is this fear that you're going to be judged as unacceptable in some way, that whatever you do is going to be disastrous or something. But a corresponding Japanese mental disorder called Teijin Kai, wait a minute, I can do this. Teijin Kaiyu Fosho. I used to be able to pronounce it. Anyway, It's similar to anxiety in that, or social anxiety, in that it is anxiety that is triggered in social situations. But what's happening is, instead of anxiety because you fear you will be harshly judged, it is anxiety because you fear that something you do will greatly offend another. It will disrupt social relationships. So it's pretty clear social anxiety disorder from a Western perspective is because of the independent way of thinking, whereas Teijin Kai Fosho is clearly a consequence of more interdependent thought and a value on group harmony that is results. Schizophrenia is considered to be the most genetically related. That is, when they do twin studies or adoption studies, they find that the heritability rate of schizophrenia is higher than any other mental. I mean, all mental disorders have some heritability rates to them, but schizophrenia is definitely the highest. So it is considered to be the one that is most strongly a physiological rather than psychological thing. Okay. So you find that there's a lot of cultural variation. I mean, not a lot of cultural variation in the prevalence of schizophrenia. That is, the rate of schizophrenia is fairly consistent around the world. And the DSM diagnosis, different, symptomology, delusions, hallucinations, at least one of the, here, what is it? Two or more of the following, each present for a significant portion of time, at least one of these delusions, continuous disturbance, include a month of symptoms, etc. All right. So it turns out that there's many subcategories of schizophrenia, multiples. And some of the largest of them being, well, I guess I'm going to go to this one. Okay, so here is a fascinating study which was done with participants in Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia has more of a traditional way of viewing things. We're going to talk about the models of mental disorders in the next video. But they have more of a traditional view of mental disorders, and so they. This is a different slide. Oh, forgive me, all that. All right, so this is a genetic relationship. I got it. So it's the most genetically blah blah blah. All right, here. I knew I was on track. I just forgot that slide was in there. So here we go. It turns out that the manifestations of schizophrenia look radically different. In the United Kingdom, the most common form of schizophrenia is paranoid schizophrenia, but it's relatively uncommon in India, even though they have the same rate or very similar rate of schizophrenia. And catatonic schizophrenia, which is pretty rare in Western samples, is in fact quite dominant in Indian samples. So pretty interesting that the same disorder manifests quite radically. Another interesting, distinct thing with schizophrenia is that for most mental disorders, it's pretty clear. Patients that have more money and a mental disorder improve faster. That's what it is, okay? And with schizophrenia, it's a little bit different. That it turns out that one of the biggest parts of the recovery is the social help. That is to say, people in independent or individualistic nations with schizophrenia are more likely to become socially isolated and lose all help and support and spiral down. Whereas people with schizophrenia in more collectivistic cultures are more likely to have the social support necessary to, say, for example, ensure they continue their medications. Okay? Here's what I'm just doing. They compared a Saudi sample and a British sample. So the Saudi sample, as I've already kind of gone off on a tangent on the wrong graph. The Saudi sample is more traditional, and the British sample is more Western, for lack of a better word. Okay. And so they basically asked him, imagine there's a guy and he thinks the dog is talking to him. Why? Okay, so you can see the blue lines, the person has brain damage, schizophrenia, it's stress. You can see the blue lines representing the British. It might as well be an American perspective. And that's what we would come to expect. But if you look at the Saudi sample, you can see that their explanation for why they believe the dog is talking to them, the biggest one here is Satan. Satan's talking to you. That's what's going on. It's a demon or something like that. Okay. And so it's pretty clear that this is going to, and we're going to get, like I said in the last video for this topic, we're going to talk about models of mental disorder. But it's pretty clear that if you have schizophrenia and your neighbors believe that the reason you have schizophrenia is because Satan is talking to you, you will be a social outcast, especially in a culture that is highly collectivistic. To be a social outcast in a collectivistic culture is the ultimate punishment. And so we can see here, if you break up different explanations of mental disorders, and we're going to talk about the biological, social, and supernatural in more details in the next topic. But you can see here that in a British sample, there's a split. That is to say, explanations for mental disorders are kind of biological, they're a function of, bad neurochemistry or brain disorders or something. Social, as in like stress and difficulty living, kind of non-specific, probably a blend of these two. None of this sample gave a supernatural or demon kind of explanation. Now, if you look up in some of these other samples, you can see that the supernatural explanation is fairly common for many people in these different cultural contexts.